Welcome back, April 15th, 2021. Our ambassador to the United Nations, the position once held by Jeane Kirkpatrick, is today held by one Linda Thomas Greenfield. She spoke to the National Action Network yesterday. That would be Al Sharpton's organization. And she said she wanted the U.S. to re-engage the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. This would be the council chaired by countries from Saudi Arabia to Cuba, countries that wouldn't know the difference between human rights and a zoo. But she didn't stop there. She went on to say, quote, "Of course, when we raise issues of equity and justice at the global scale, we have to approach them with humility. The original sin of slavery weaved white supremacy into our founding documents and principles." Close quote. White supremacy is weaved into our founding documents and principles. This from the person representing the moral strength and position of the United States to the rest of the world. White supremacy is weaved into our founding documents and principles. There was a serious view of the veracity of that statement once upon a time. It was held by the Confederate States of America, the side of the Civil War that backed, supported, defended, fought for, and justified slavery by claiming our founding was a lie. In other words, if you want serious support for the position that our founding was based in and on slavery and white supremacy, that view certainly existed. It just existed in the minds of those who started the Civil War and lost it. I never thought I'd see the day where social justice warriors and the woke would embrace the philosophy of the slave-defending side of the American Civil War. To put a fine point on it, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Frederick Douglass, so many, too many to mention, all thought our founders wanted to put slavery on the course of extinction. Their opponents, the Confederacy, from Jefferson Davis to Alexander Stephens to too many others on the wrong side of history to name, Lincoln's and Grant's opponents believed the founders meant to justify and embrace and protect slavery. The same view as our ambassador to the United Nations. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations supports the Confederacy of the United States. That would be a heck of a headline. We'll never see it. It could not be more accurate. To understand how insidious this is, consider we have whole generations and now evidently official spokesmen and women for America that believe Lincoln was wrong and Jefferson Davis was right. They believe Roger Taney was right in his rendering of American history found in the Dred Scott decision that said the black man had no rights, which the white man is bound to respect. There was a dissent, too, actually, in the Dred Scott case. They saw our founding differently. They saw it as Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln saw it, as a glorious liberty moment. Harry Jaffa put it this way: Justice Taney's opinion in Dred Scott was wrong for one paramount reason. He did not see that the Constitution, grounded in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, reflected any standard of justice other than the positive law. He did not see that the word person meant any human person, whatever his race, creed, or nation. In December 1860, Abraham Lincoln wrote to his old friend Alexander Stephens, who he hoped was still a friend and not an enemy. He wrote, quote, "You think slavery is right and ought to be extended, while we think it is wrong and ought to be restricted. That, I suppose, is the rub," close quote. Yep, that was the rub. And the wrong, distorted view was rubbed out. Why we cannot celebrate that takes us back to the whole argument about learning history. We don't, and for all the wrong reasons. Thus propaganda reigns. But it is with humility I think we should concede to a view of the world that would dismiss Washington, Madison, Lincoln, and Douglas. A little humanity would go a long way today, but that too requires an understanding of human nature as much as it does an understanding of history. So we have a UN ambassador that stands with Roger B. Tawney, and as I say, the Confederate reading of American history and America's founding. No surprise that, and she agrees with the ideological and historical foundations behind the flag her side tells us should come down from Southern capitals. Here's how Jefferson Davis put it, quote, "We recognize the Negro as God and God's book of God's laws in nature as the way he tells us to recognize him. Inferior, fitted expressly for servitude," close quote. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Alexander Stephens, the vice president. Alexander Stephens put the founding in history this way, quote, "The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, politically. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon expressly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is the natural and normal condition," close quote. Got it? The Confederacy viewed Thomas Jefferson as wrong. Robert B. Tawney put it this way: the black man had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Each and every one of those foregoing theories is what you hear about our founding today in America's classrooms. And now our UN ambassador. This is the view of our founding, that slavery was seen to be a good thing. This is the view of the, if not the purpose of the 1619 Project. There was another view, articulated most profoundly by the very man whose name was removed from a high school in San Francisco this year. Abraham Lincoln would put things more like this, quote, "Wise statesmen as they were, they knew the tendency of prosperity to breed tyrants, and so they established these great self-evident truths that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up the doctrine that none but rich men or none but white men were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit and circumscribe the great principles on which the Temple of Liberty was being built," close quote. That was Lincoln. Here was more Lincoln. Quote, "When Judge Douglas says he boldly denies that the Declaration of Independence includes Negroes at all, I protest against that counterfeit logic. Slavery is founded in the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it in his love of justice. Repeal the Missouri Compromise, repeal all compromises, repeal the Declaration of Independence, repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be the abundance of man's heart that slavery extension is wrong." Lincoln said this: "Our adversaries, the Confederate States, have adopted some declarations of independence in which, unlike the good old one, written by Jefferson, omits the words all men are created equal. Why? They have adopted a temporary national constitution, in the preamble of which, unlike our good old one signed by Washington, they omit we the people and substitute we the deputies of the sovereign and independent states. Why? Why this deliberate pressing out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people?" And Lincoln put it this way: "My countrymen, if you have been taught doctrines conflicting with the great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, if you have listened to suggestions which would take away from its grandeur and mutilate the fair symmetry of its proportions, if you have been inclined to believe that all men are not created equal in those inalienable rights enumerated by our Charter of Liberty, let me entreat you to come back. Return to the fountain whose waters spring close by the blood of the Revolution. Come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. Do not destroy the immortal emblem of humanity, the Declaration of Independence. Close quote. Again, one side believed in the natural rights based on our common humanity as articulated in the Declaration of Independence, and one side believed our Declaration of Independence was a lie. One side believed our Constitution was meant to embrace the first understandings, and one side believed it was meant to embrace the second. The side of the first, in both cases, was bigger than the side of the second. The side of the first, in both cases, won the Civil War. And today, we arrive at a national pedagogy that instructs us in the rightness and morality and history of the second side, the second theory, the losing side, the losing theory, that our founders meant to make slavery entrenched and forever in the United States. And our children are increasingly bombarded not just with those thoughts, but with the junk thought that leads them to believe an anthem to our nation is an anthem to slavery. It is not. It is an anthem to the greatest nation in the history of the world that has given more freedom to more people than any other country in the history of the world. Next speech from our UN ambassador, I expect her to call us what Khrushchev did. Colonialist and imperialist. She already got the racist part of the Khrushchev triad. We need to open an American desk at the U.S. mission to the United Nations. There are enough anti-American ones that they don't need the U.S. representative to be taken by Stockholm Syndrome to join those backward gaggles. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.